Negotiations tend to be complicated and difficult when information about threat values and the cooperative solution is private. Private information impedes bargaining because much of it must be converted into public information before computing reasonable terms for cooperation. In general, bargaining is costly when it requires converting a lot of private information into public information. To illustrate, negotiations for the sale of a house involve many issues of finance, timing, quality, and price. The seller of a house knows a lot more about its hidden defects than the buyer knows, and the buyer knows a lot more about his or her ability to obtain financing than the seller knows. Each attempts to extract these facts from the other over the course of negotiations. To a degree, the parties may want to divulge some information, but they may be reluctant to divulge all. Each party's share of the cooperative surplus depends in part on keeping some information private, but concluding the bargain requires making some information public. Balancing these conflicting poles is difficult and potentially costly. There is an extensive literature on bargaining games, including a large number of carefully constructed experiments testing the Coase theorem, superscript 12, which reads C.J. Keith Murninghan, Bargaining Games, 1992, for a highly readable summary for this literature. For specific experiments on the Coase theorem, see Elizabeth Hoffman and Matthew Spitzer, the Coase theorem. Uh, 25. J. Law and Econ 73, 1982, and Hoffman and Spitzer, experimental tests of the Coase theorem with large bargaining games. 15J. Legal Stud, 149, 1986. Ian Ayres has recently argued that, contrary to these findings, ambiguous rights induce bargaining. See our website for more. One of the most robust conclusions of these experiments is that bargainers are more likely to cooperate when their rights are clear and less likely to agree when their rights are ambiguous. Put in more formal terms, bargaining games are easier to solve when the threat values are public knowledge. The rights of the parties define their threat values in legal disputes. One implication of this finding is that property law ought to favor criteria for determining ownership that are clear and simple. The most immediate prescription for efficient property law is to make rights clear and simple. For example, a system for the public registration of ownership of claims to land avoids many disputes and makes settlement easier for those that arise. Similarly, the fact that someone possesses or uses an item of property is easily to confirm. In view of this fact, the law gives weight to possession and use when determining ownership. Conversely, unclear ownership rights are a major obstacle to cooperation and a major cause of wasted resources. Thus, squatters who occupy land while others in developing countries fail to improve their dwellings because it is not clear that they would own the improvements. Most of our bargaining examples concern two parties. Communication between two parties is usually cheap, especially when they are near each other. However, many bargains involve three or more parties. Bargaining becomes more costly and difficult as it involves more parties, especially if they are dispersed from one another. This fact may explain why treaties involving many nations are so difficult to conclude. Finally, the parties may want to draft an agreement, and this may be costly because it must anticipate many contingencies that can arise to change the value of the bargain.